Welcome to the Underground, my little underground with Peter A.
It's My Little Underground. I'm Peter A. This week on the show, I'm so happy to welcome music journalist Liz Pelly to talk about her brand new book, Mood Machine: The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. And Liz talks about her main motivation for writing this book, the importance of supporting local music scenes, the wild, wild west of post piracy, pre streaming music period, and the current status of human curation of music in the age of streaming. Please help me welcome music journalist Liz Pelly to My Little Underground.
My little underground.
Liz Pelly, congrats on your amazing new book, Mood Machine. And I'm so glad you're on My Little Underground to talk about this very important subject. And I thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I know you've been so busy, but I thank you for taking time out of your busy press schedule to talk with me. But I want to ask you, like, how long has this book been in the works?
Well, yeah, I know. Thanks for reading the book and thanks for wanting to chat with me about it. Yeah, it's such an interesting question. How long it's been in the works because I published my first article about Spotify in 2017, and wrote a series of essays about the streaming model and the impacts of streaming on listening and artists and music from 2017, basically like until I started working on the book, which I started working on in 2022. So really depends how you think about it. I've either been working on this since 2017 or since 2022, depending how you think about it. But it's really like, more like 3 years ago that I started working on the book kind of seriously. But there's some interviews in the book that were, maybe interviews that I had done with people back in 2019, 2020 that I did, and then I just never did anything with. And they were just sort of like really interesting conversations about um, streaming or the impact of streaming on musicians, but I just never had like a home for. So it was cool to get to weave in a few of those. And there's also some quotes in the book that come from essays that I wrote for the Baffler and some other places. So there's a little bit of the reporting from those previous articles woven into the book as well. And specifically, there's like 2 or 3 chapters in the book that are basically like modified, updated versions of essays I had written in the past, but a lot of it is new reporting and new writing too.
Yeah, it seems like I remember seeing some of your commentary on Spotify on social media a few years back, and the first thing that jumped to my head, I'm like, this has got to be a book eventually. So I'm glad it is.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had been kind of sticking with the story for a while. So over the years, people would always kind of be like, oh, you should turn this into a book. And it's kind of, um, yeah, just wild that it finally exists and I'm staring at it.
Yeah, exactly. Talk to me about the research for this book. Can you tell me some challenges and some rewarding experiences doing interviews with former Spotify employees, record label folks, and the like?
Yeah, totally. So one thing going into writing the book that I knew from the beginning was that I knew that I wanted to try to include the voices of a lot of musicians because I feel like writing about the music business and it's a book about the music business, but I also feel like it's like a book about music culture also, and politics and labor and surveillance, but stories about the music business tend to cut out the voices of musicians themselves often. So I knew I wanted to include a lot of perspectives from musicians. And something else I knew is that, uh, there have been chronicles of the rise of streaming that have been published in the past, but often not often from an independent music perspective. The story of streaming often gets told to a story of like the long saga of the negotiations between the major labels and Spotify, which is interesting and important because that is a big part of how this model came to exist. But I also wanted to make sure that I had, a really strong presence of independent musicians, independent labels, to make sure that the story of how independent labels got involved in streaming, like what made independent labels want to kind of like sign on with the streaming model at the beginning, and to make sure I was specifically talking about how independent labels and independent musicians had been impacted by this model, because it's something that gets talked about less frequently. So there are some sort of like maybe like goals like that, but yeah, the research involved interviews. So I interviewed over 100 sources, as it says in the press release for the book, but it's true. I did interview, I think it was like 107 people as the final count, though that number might be different. Actually, I don't even really remember. And then some other sources that I drew on, it's not just interviews with like, it's like interviews with musicians, people who worked at independent record labels, people who worked in the music business, former Spotify employees. Then also stuff like, I interviewed some academic researchers, some other journalists, some people at the intersection of like music and policy work, union organizers, um, uh, lawyer, a range of different sources. And then some other material that I drew on for the book, there's kind of like a wealth of academic work on streaming and the impact of the streaming model. And one thing that I wanted to sort of do is like highlight and try to you know take some of the learnings from some of that academic work and cite it and make it accessible in a way, if I could. So there that like that's kind of like one type of source that is brought into the book. I went to Sweden a couple of times for it. I reviewed a lot of like internal documents. So like there are Slack messages that I was able to review that are cited in the book, and different like internal documents and stuff. And then experiences, because it's such like a digital story that exists so much online. Like basically any opportunity I could get to like report on something that was happening in person, whether it be like going to a Spotify stages show at Baby's All Right, or going to a protest that musicians were holding for something having to do with music labor. I tried to do like as much of that as I could to kind of like put some scene setting and some like human faces and stuff in the book. So that's yeah, a little bit about like some of the source material. Oh, and sorry, I should say one other thing too. Another source that the book really relied on was like digging through the archives of the music press, and music publications from the late 2000s when Spotify was about to launch. And then also like a lot of YouTube videos. YouTube launched like around the same time as Spotify. So there's actually like a ton of documentation of conference appearances from Spotify executives in the early years of the company on YouTube. Just like these videos that have been on YouTube since like 2009 with like 100 views. And some of those were like super super helpful to watch in trying to piece together the early history of the company. uh yeah, and more, but that's probably a good place to stop for now.
It seems like in the past, when someone would write a book and they would research, they would spend time in a library. But like you said, like it's a digital thing. It's an online thing. You can just your source of academic truth, as it were, is online, which is amazing. And I know you said you're doing this with artists and music culture in mind. Now, do you think that, or do you feel that this was your main motivation for this book, or if not, what was?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I definitely feel like, I'm kind of like it's really funny, like as a journalist, you're expected to write kind of objectively. And it's funny that having like a pro artist perspective could be seen as like some sort of agenda or something. But something in writing the book that I try to be clear about is that it's reported criticism. So, there are some chapters that are more investigative or journalistic, but it's definitely a book that has a really clear perspective. And I'm not like a person who is, or a writer who's kind of like afraid of making that perspective known to some degree. You know, it has it has a kind of like viewpoint that I feel like shapes. I think that all journalists, like, no matter how objective you try to be, like, what you care about always comes through on the page. Um, but it probably is good to highlight that it's not pure reporting. It's reporting and criticism mixed, and the point of view or perspective, I think, is definitely like, um yeah, thinking about the impact of streaming on listeners and also on artists, and thinking about what some of the consequences have been. Um, I think something that drove me really early on was, trying to sort of like hearing all these myths that were sort of shaped in the early era of streaming about how music streaming was going to be this democratic force for music, and that streaming was this like data driven meritocracy, and the music that did well on streaming was just music that was becoming popular because it was the best, or something that Spotify said all the time at the beginning, and honestly still says. They always use this phrase like leveling the playing field, like streaming is going to level the playing field for artists. And um, I think that one of my like early goals was just sort of like, from talking musicians, from understanding how the music business works, from seeing the impact that streaming was having on musicians, just sort of knowing that that wasn't true and wanting to kind of like do some of the work of sort of like helping debunk some of those myths. That was maybe like a early motivation. I also think that as someone who's a journalist but also a participant in music culture and independent music, part of, I think, being involved in independent music, at least like, for me, I'm someone who like is really interested in the history of independent music and like what that phrase means. While I was writing my book, I actually taught a class at NYU called "What is Indie?" question mark. That was sort of about like interrogating the meaning of the concept of indie or independence in the popular imagination, and like trying to figure out like what people mean when they talk about independent music. And that's something that's always like interesting to me, is like, what do we mean when we say independent from what, like. And I think that you know part of answering that question or like following that thread is this kind of like constant negotiation of, what are the centers of power in music. And at the time that I started working on this broader reporting project, it was clear that these tech companies in partnership with the major labels had sort of like evolved as these new centers of power in music, and that may be part of figuring out like what it means to be independent in the 21st century. Also involves kind of like expanding the meaning of independent to also involve some sort of like uh, reckoning with tech power.
So when that's something I think about a lot, not of course like in an academic sense, but like the meaning of like independent and sort of indie music, and you're talking about just being independent is kind of void of certain powers that be, either a label or some sort of tech app, be it Spotify or even Bandcamp, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that, it's super interesting. Like, Bandcamp has come up in a lot of conversations because people always ask me like how I listen to music, and I always have to kind of like give this huge spiel because Bandcamp is one of the main ways that I listen to music, but it's certainly not like, it's deserving of its own sort of like critique and questioning, especially as it's like changed hands between different corporate owners in recent years and all this like union busting stuff. But it's kind of like the way some people are like sort of trapped in the Spotify bubble. Like I'm like kind of like some other people a little bit like trapped in the Bandcamp bubble. And the reality is like as it stands, it's a model that makes a lot more sense for most independent musicians than streaming. But yeah, always trying to, diversify where I get my music from and buy music directly from artists like outside of these ecosystems and directly from them at their shows and things like that when possible. But yeah, I think that, if historically independence has meant like, the early definition of the phrase when it like emerged had to do with independence from the major record labels. I think like today maybe it also involves grappling with these platforms as well. And I think, something that's really interesting to me is when you think back on like the history of independent music, like independent scenes always have kind of, defined themselves in as alternatives to the major labels, but they also have always kind of there's like other values that they've represented too. Like independent labels serve musicians that are operating on a smaller scale. It's like how I always talk about is like one of the values of like independent music scenes also is supporting small scale cultural production. And that is much different than like the type of music that is served by the streaming status quo, which is like music that generates like as many streams as possible. Like streaming is set up to benefit music that scales up, whereas like independent music has historically been more about like how do you support music. I mean, some versions of independent music is also vast and different people have different goals, but like part of it is like how do you support music operating on a smaller scale. And then I think also like independent music scenes, in addition to those things, also there's been like a focus on localism. So things that I often think about are like when you're like thinking about streaming or like alternatives to streaming, it's not just like how do you support independent music outside of these like really consolidated corporate platforms, but also like how do you use the digital tools to support small scale cultural production, to support like localism in music and these things that have historically been really important in independent music.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's kind of my MO. I love talking to artists that are doing their own thing in their area, and if I can go directly to their website or maybe through Bandcamp and support them directly, I'm cool. If I find their album at a record store and it's a decent price, I'll pick it up. It makes me feel better and it makes kind of the music sound better. Like, oh, I'm directly supporting this artist that's so talented that you know I can find on these big tech platforms, but if I can go direct get it directly from them for me without any internet or nothing like that, it's just a better feeling to me.
Yeah, totally. And also, like, not to, like, over intellectualize it or something, but I
Of course.
definitely noticed the name of the podcast, like, My Little Underground, it sort of, like, gets at that thing that I was saying about, like, supporting small scale cultural production. It's like, what makes music meaningful to people, like, isn't always just like, what is the biggest and, like, most popular thing, like, for people who are involved in underground scenes, like, it is, like, you know, just different. Like, it's about supporting your little underground.
That it literally, yes, and because I don't know how to do anything else, I don't know how to appeal to everybody,
Mhm.
and also I love the Jesus and Mary chain too, so
Oh,
there's that.
cool. Okay, that's where the name comes from? Yeah, cool.
No, but what you said is what you just said about the show and the name are things that have been in my head and how I go about doing the show. So you're not wrong at all. So,
Cool, cool.
uh, so you want to talk about leveling the playing field, right? These ghost artists that are appearing on these chill playlists, right? Can you explain a little bit about what that means? Because it is just it's unbelievable. When I read that in some of your early excerpts of the book before Moon Machine came out, I was like, Excuse you, what?"
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny seeing how that part of the book seems to have really, struck a nerve widely with people. So there's a chapter of the book, it's chapter 5, called Ghost Artists for Hire. And it was the first excerpt from the book last month in Harper's Magazine. And it basically chronicles how, around 2016, 2017, uh, kind of at the beginning of what a former Spotify employee described to me as the peak playlist era. So, like, this moment when the concept of the Spotify playlist, like editor curated playlists, started sort of like carrying all of this weight in the music industry. And that was like around when I first started writing about the company. And the first article I wrote about Spotify was about Spotify playlists, and they had become kind of like this cultural phenomenon. And musicians were expected to like pitch their music to Spotify playlists, and if they got on them, it was like a big deal all of a sudden. It was sort of like the front page of the app was suddenly like all these like curated playlists, well, that had started like a few years earlier. But um yeah, so um around the same time, like 2017, when my first article came out, like one of the first emails that I got after this article about Spotify playlists came out, I can remember, like, where I was when I got this email. I was like walking on Flushing Avenue in Bushwick, and I got an email from someone that was like, "Cool article. Like, by the way, you should research fake artists on Spotify. It's a really big problem, and everyone in the independent music community is really concerned about this." And I was like, "Oh, that's weird. Spotify's making fake artists," but I kind of, not like brushed it off. I just like it was very confusing to me. And then it turns out that the music business trade press actually had already been covering this since the previous year. So I was like, oh, okay, Music Business Worldwide covered this already. But the article in Music Business Worldwide, um, said that a source had told them that Spotify was creating their own fake artists to fill their lean back playlists for studying and chilling and sleeping and focusing. And Spotify like really quickly denied that they had been making these artists or that they were creating them, but they didn't really deny the existence of some sort of broader arrangement. And there are articles in the music business press, like here and there, about this, like kind of more speculative, like over the years, like what's happening? Who are these fake artists? Like, why is there all of this music that seems like stock music, like in these popular focus playlists and study playlists? Like, where is it coming from? Um, and it wasn't until 2022 that this Swedish newspaper did a bigger investigation into it, and they were able to get access to these copyright documents from this like royalty collection society. And they were able to prove that there were, hundreds and hundreds of tracks on the platform attributed to different artist monikers that were getting really prime placement on these sort of more background listening Spotify playlists, mostly in instrumental genres. And they were all attributed to a really small handful of Swedish songwriters who were working with this one company in this small town in Sweden called Firefly Entertainment. And that was one of the companies that people had long sort of like noticed in the label tab on some of these artists that they maybe thought were fake artists. So yeah, it was always kind of one of these like open questions. And one of the things about the book that was like kind of satisfying to me is that, as I covered Spotify over the years and wrote these various like reported essays on Spotify, I would like do interviews kind of like this one, or I would do like conference appearances and people would ask me questions. And sometimes they would ask me questions about things that I didn't know the answer to. And oftentimes people would ask me about the fake artist thing. And I'd say, what I knew from, um, the trade press that had come out, but I would say, yeah, I really don't know anything else. So when I finally started writing the book, I was like, okay, it's opportunity. the time and the resources to finally like dig into some of these like questions people have been asking me for years I don't have the answers to. And one of them was the fake artist stuff. So I started interviewing like musicians, people who worked in the music business at the time, former Spotify employees, and it was actually really surprising to uncover through a combination of interviews and the internal records that I was able to review that this actually was an internal sort of program at Spotify with a name called Perfect Fit Content. And that there was this team of editors that are assigned to look after all of these, tons of mood playlists, and that there is a specific group of production companies that were commissioning this music from musicians and then licensing it to Spotify under terms that were, cheaper for Spotify. So uh, I also was able to talk to like some of the musicians who had been commissioned by these production companies, and it was really interesting because some of them were like, yeah, like I make the music and I send it in and I don't really know what happens after that. Like I get my check and like I don't know how it ends up on these playlists. So like even the musicians themselves like didn't really know anything about the relationship that these production companies had with Spotify or the ways in which like this work was sort of being given like privileged access to these curators in order to fill out these playlists in a way that saved Spotify money. And there's all sorts of reasons why this is like concerning, but I would say that the number one reason would be, I mean, it's hard to rank them. There's many reasons, but one being that there's no shortage of musicians out there in the world operating in the realms of classical, jazz, ambient music, and lo-fi hip-hop beat making that are trying to piece together a living from streaming platforms in order to support their work, support their music practice, who have been really affected by this because they've maybe been removed from these playlists and replaced with stock music, or they're being shut out of opportunities to reach these really large audiences that are coming to these playlists. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff.
So is it these mystery ghost artists, are they only appearing on these chill playlists, or is it on a multitude of genres?
Yeah, yeah. So it's mainly instrumental music that's affected by it. So there'll be,
Okay.
chill playlists, study playlists, ambient relaxation playlists. But then, there's some that are just kind of like maybe playlists you would put on in the background while, making dinner or something like that. Like, I think one of the ones I saw that was in uh cited in my book, actually, maybe I should just like pull up the lists that I reference in my book, but I think there was like a bossa nova playlist that was impacted
Wow.
by it, to yeah, ambient relaxation, deep focus, 100% lounge, bossa nova dinner, cocktail jazz. Those are the names of the playlists that I list that were 90% PFC tracks at the time that I was reporting my book. Um, so yeah, it's instrumental music, but it's music, genres of music that like there are active scenes and communities and histories and traditions, no shortage of music that could be on those playlists instead. And in addition to like artists getting cut off from a financial possibility, it's also just sort of like, even when you're listening to music in the background, there's still an opportunity that you might be working in, some you're listening to something and like it catches your ear and you're like, oh, that song's really cool, like who made that, like I want to save their album, or like, whoa, what is this, I need to know like what album this is from, or I need to know who this artist is. And maybe you go down a rabbit hole and end up doing a lot of research on like, some ambient musician or some jazz musician who you had never heard of before. And when what you're listening to is just like pure, vibe fodder stock music, there's like absolutely no opportunity for making any sort of connection to an artist or to music or like a connection to, some sort of broader scene or anything at all. And I think one of the reasons that people like music is for their ability to, make those connections and, learn and because people care about the artists who make the music that they listen to some extent.
Yeah, I know I do. Um,
Yeah.
it, you spoke at a conference in Europe in 2019, and you mentioned Spotify core, stream bait pop, right? And that idea that a lot of artists would make their music that are tailored to whatever analytics Spotify gave them about their music. Do you look at that as like the new radio friendly?
Yeah. So something that I talk about in my book, like I have this chapter called The Conquest of Chill, and I kind of talk about the chill playlist as this sort of like current um manifestation of easy listening that has always kind of existed on the radio, but I also talk about it in the context of uh mood music as mood stabilization, and I kind of talk about that dynamic and how it has sort of like played out historically because it's certainly not like Spotify playlists or like the first times that people have ever turned to music as for certain moods or as a form of mood stabilization. But it is interesting that this is kind of like where this is playing out currently. There are some things about it that make the current environment much different. To stream bait, I think is, when I wrote this essay in 2018. So that's one of the chapters of the book that is very much like a chapter of the book that is based on an essay I previously wrote. So I wrote this essay in 2018 called Stream Bait Pop that was about the different ways in which the streaming environment and the popularity of chill playlists and the popularity of playlists in general, honestly, had been affecting the sound of pop music and the types of music that get popular in the streaming era, and how the kind of decontextualization of music and recontextualization of music by moods and vibes had sort of led to this boom of functional music, including this boom of chill playlists, and how the popularity of these playlists was sort of incentivizing certain musicians, either in some cases incentivizing musicians to make music that could fit into these playlist categories, calling that stream bait. Or maybe it's not incentivizing musicians to make music like this, but musicians who happen to make music that does really well in these playlist categories are being repeatedly rewarded in a system that sort of claims to be this data driven meritocracy. So it's like, there's lots of factors that I think like play into shaping the type of music that quote unquote like does well on streaming. And in my book, in the section on Spotify core or stream bait, and the impact of streaming on like how music sounds and this kind of like rise of this kind of like new version of easy listening. I also interview some people from some independent record labels who talk about how in the streaming era, like the type of music that is rewarded and becomes popular and financially sustainable is basically like music that could be played on the background in the background at a coffee shop. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Nothing wrong with music like that. I love plenty of music that could be played in the background at a coffee shop. And in fact, like there's music I love by musicians who I'm friends with who I will often hear on these coffee shop playlists when I'm out in the world, like, doing work somewhere. It's not like the fault of these musicians. It's just a reality that like there is a certain type of music that does well in the, you know, uh, streaming environment and the way it has kind of like shaped certain ways of listening to music, and there's certain music that doesn't do well in this environment. And frankly, even the musicians who end up on these playlists, who I'll hear like on these playlists, who appear to be doing well, like even some of them like aren't necessarily like uh seeing like that much financial success from it all, especially groups that have like multiple members who are signed to labels. Maybe they're still paying back in advance to their label. Maybe they have like multiple songwriters on a track. Like there's so many things that factor into like how the royalty pot gets split up. But anyway, I'm on a little bit of a ramble right now.
Yeah, like with there's a lot of artists that I heard that I like too, and even know that I've heard in some restaurants or a hip bar in Soho. But me personally, I also want to hear the head turning stuff. That's like, wait, what? What was that?
Mhm.
That kind of just kind of sets you back a little bit and kind of makes you feel almost a little uncomfortable in a good way. I'm looking for stuff like that as well, a healthy balance. Uh,
Yeah.
so in your book, you talk about Spotify going out for their first music license from record labels, and you said that the music industry wasn't prepared for those conversations. Do I have that right? What was that about?
Oh, yeah. Well, so, uh, there's like a couple things. So I document like, yeah, this moment post piracy, pre streaming, where the music business was like in some ways kind of like if you talk to some people in the mainstream music business at the time, they'll say that the record industry like always knew that streaming was going to be the savior, and that eventually like we were going to be shifting to a streaming landscape. It was just a matter of like when a company would come along that had perfected the technology or had like a good enough product. But then if you talk to people who are trying to start um, music startups at the time. Like I interviewed the founder of the Hype Machine, who was kind of like in that sort of like music tech scene, pre-streaming, like mid 2000s. There were all sorts of examples of like more interesting digital music startups that like tried to get off the ground at the time, but the major labels kind of like weren't willing to have a conversation with them to give them the licenses that they needed. Like, I always think back on this is not in my book, but there was this app like in the late 2000s called 8 Tracks that became really popular for a moment. And did you ever see this app?
No.
Okay. No, sorry, not 8 Tracks. It was called Mux Tape. I think that's what it was. And it was like just this website where you could basically just like um make a mixtape like in a browser-based player, and
Okay.
you just throw in links from I think it was mostly YouTube, or you can load in MP3s that you had, and you can just make a mixtape that would then be embeddable. And it was just this like really easy way to make an embeddable playlist. But it pretty quickly got shut down by the RIAA, like the major label lobbying group, because they didn't have the right licenses or whatever.
It's called
And it
Mugbound?
was like Mux Tape,
Mug's
MUXT.
tape.
Yeah, this is like really going back, but I remember the time thinking it was like really cool. And even to date, like I feel like there's never been anything like this easy to use to just like make a mix really quickly and be able to like people would like embed them in their blogs and like um but obviously, yeah, there is no license, so like this like couldn't happen.
Right.
But I remember it was this moment. It was like an early moment of watching like the major labels kind of like shut down, like a kind of cool thing that people were excited about. And I don't think that they ever were able to get the licenses, and that tool just like it just like never came back. Um, so that's kind of like what I'm alluding to in that moment, is that, there were some conversations that maybe like the music business like wasn't ready for, or like some things that they just like weren't willing to like let happen during that interesting like in between time.
Yeah, like I remember in the early App Store era, right? Like this is like 2008, 2009-ish. There were apps that were kind of like that. That kind of violated so many different music copyright laws, the MP3 downloaders and stuff like that that suddenly just disappeared. So yeah, I don't remember this app specifically, but there was stuff that was like this that existed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So
such, like, an
yeah,
interesting, like, kind of, like, I feel like it's a interesting, like, not super documented, like, moment in, like, digital music culture, the, like, post file sharing, pre-streaming era, and I tried to do, like, a little bit to document, like, a little bit of that moment in the book, but, there were definitely moments while I was working on it where I was like, "This would be an interesting research project in itself," you know? Like,
yeah,
2000s, digital music history, because I had, like, in the late 2000s, I had a music blog and was really like invested in the whole like music blog era. And it was just like such a different time to be someone who was like excited about sharing music on the internet, I think.
yeah. And there was also, or if you ever had like an Apple device and you jailbroke it, there were a lot of apps that what you're talking about that are just like that I even use. Like, oh, I can download little songs here. Like, I don't have to go through iTunes or Pirate Bay or whatever it was.
Cool.
Yeah, like yeah, I agree with you. It's a very interesting time. The Wild Wild West, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you also say in your book that Spotify considered piracy as their main competition, not like other sort of music platforms. And at the time, like Spotify was getting going, there was Rhapsody, there was even the iTunes store. But was it just kind of like a different model? They were starting to get into the subscription based, business model, or what? Like, why did they think that piracy was just their only competition or their main competition rather?
Yeah, I think that, that's partially owing to the fact that the company was based in Sweden, where,
Okay.
piracy was so popular in Sweden. And something that's kind of interesting about it is that, like, according to conversations that I had with people in Stockholm, and also just like reading some, articles, press articles, and stuff about it, like it seemed that piracy wasn't just popular in Sweden, but it also was just discussed really different in a much more like political way, where it wasn't necessarily this automatic given that piracy was bad. There was a lot more questioning of like, well, maybe it's good that people have access to culture, and maybe that's something that we should be fighting for. There was a lot more like pro piracy sentiment, or definitely maybe just more kind of like neutral ambivalence towards it. There's even like a pirate party in Sweden. There's like a political party that's like main, policy uh, platform was, being pro piracy. um, so because of that, if you're a company like Spotify and you were thinking of like, okay, who are the people that we're trying to draw to our platform? It's all of the people who currently love music piracy, or all of the people who currently love like file sharing. So the way that they would always talk about it in the press was that they weren't necessarily trying to like, fight piracy. They were trying to offer something that was quote unquote better than piracy. But it's really interesting. Like it's, just looking at all of the different early press appearances and the ways that they kind of like positions themselves and who they partnered with and stuff. It was clear that they kind of like positions themselves as a alternative to fighting piracy when they were trying to appeal to the major labels who they needed to, partner with in order to get their licenses signed. And then they would, position themselves as like, kind of pro piracy when they were trying to attract music piracy lovers to their platform as customers, or even some of their engineers that they hired. Like one of the engineers that they hired to help build the product, the beta product, was like someone who was really big in the piracy scene. This guy Ludwig Strius, I probably said his last name wrong, but it was someone from uTorrent who ended up being involved in helping build Spotify.
Yeah. So when it comes to Spotify Wrapped, right? Do you think that, or maybe it's probably obvious, but that these kind of things are just keeping users in their own listening bubble, and like discovery is kind of like an illusion in a way?
I think so. I mean, I feel like, over the years, it has become, apparent that the concept of discovery has sort of, not just on Spotify, but like maybe in streaming in general, the concept of discovery has taken a bit of a backseat to just the project of keeping people engaged and boosting user engagement and keeping the streams flowing and the data pumping,
Yeah. W- That being said, all the things that the streaming services are doing these days. Where do you think this leaves like, human curation?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Like I think that human curation of music is extremely important. I'm a music journalist. Part of what music journalists do is sift through music and try to help, you know, figure out like what is exciting and artistically interesting and worth trying to write about. Like in some ways there's lots of different roles of what music journalists do in contextualizing and complicating and critiquing music, but one of the things that music journalists do is recommend. So I think that it's like infinitely more interesting to get a recommendation for music from a person who is really well versed in the music culture that they write about or that they recommend music within, or just like from someone who really cares and is really curious. Like you don't even, to me, like need to necessarily be like an expert in the history of some like musical genre for me to like be interested in your recommendations. If you're just someone who is like a participant in a music scene and like really curious and like engaged in a local music community, for example. To me, that's like so important, and it's also just like part of the connective glue that like helps make music scenes happen. Is people doing that work of writing about music and connecting dots and helping like create context within music. It's so important. I also think that it's important from my perspective to have instances of that happening like outside of the not just streaming services, but like outside of like consolidated corporate media. So like that's why like local media is so important. That's why independent media is so important. Community media is so important because, like I write in the book, like a lot of the problems of the streaming era are problems of corporate media consolidation more broadly. And one of the big risks of corporate media consolidation is that when media is consolidated, like you lose, uh, all of the you lose out on like a diversity of voices and perspectives that like aren't anything that's not like moving the needle you're going to miss out on basically. So there's so many reasons why I think like a human recommendation from like an actual person, uh and not just that, but also like outside of the confines of corporate media is really important.
Well said. Well, Liz, thank you so much for coming on My Little Underground to talk about Mood Machine. Where can people buy the book?
Oh, thank you so much.
Hmm.
Okay, so there are still, you could buy the book from your local independent bookstore. If you don't have a local independent bookstore, you can also, I something I've learned about since becoming an author is this website called bookshop.org, through which you can order the book. And it will connect, you'll order it through an independent bookstore on that website. Also, if you want, you can buy it through Greenlight Books in Brooklyn, which is an independent bookstore that is selling signed copies of the book if you want that. But yeah, yeah, just don't buy it on Amazon and I'll be happy.
Well, you're gonna hate me. I bought your book on Amazon.
Oh, hey, I'm grateful that you read it, and I'm grateful for your time too, so it's all good.
My bad. Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
My Little Underground.